Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at the Analogue 3D. The company sent it out for me to test and I've had it for a couple weeks. Now in some ways I might be the best and the absolute worst person to review this console because in the mid-90s when the Nintendo 64 first came out, I was in the middle of high school and I really wasn't playing video games. So I was mostly focusing on school and I was working at Burger King at the time and playing in punk rock bands, and so I really didn't play much Nintendo 64. It wasn't until 2020 when I started getting into emulation handhelds that I even started playing this console in the first place, and so all of my background is actually in emulation. And so this puts me in a unique position where all of my background is emulating these games, but now I'm actually testing it on FPGA hardware, which is supposed to be cycle accurate with the original console. And so in preparing for this video, I had a lot of catching up to do. I had to test on an original console to get the feel of the actual Nintendo 64, and then test that against the Analogue 3D. And I will say, coming out of this after 2 weeks of intense time with the Nintendo 64, I've never loved this console more than I do right now, and the Analogue 3D is one of the main reasons for it. One of the things I learned throughout this process is that when emulating a system that I'm not personally familiar with, there's always this little nagging feeling in the back of my head, like, are these games playing correctly? Are the graphics accurate? And is the game playing correctly in terms of the controller and how it's all mapped and the input delay? And the more familiar I became with the original console, the more confident I felt about the Analogue 3D and how good it is in terms of playing Nintendo 64 games in a modern era. So this is going to be a long video. I'm going to talk about my process of getting acquainted with the Analogue 3D and the Nintendo 64 writ large, and how I fell in love with both systems at once. We got a lot to unpack, so grab your favorite snack and drink and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's start at the very beginning and talk about what is the Analogue 3D. This thing is the world's first FPGA console designed for the Nintendo 64. Now, if you're not familiar with it, FPGA stands for Field Programmable Gate Array, and the idea is that these are special chips that can emulate at a circuit level the original hardware of whatever it's trying to emulate. Now, some people will go as far as to say it's not emulation at all, and there's others who will say it's all semantics and it's hardware versus software emulation. I kind of split the difference between the two. I don't really care what it's called, but I know what it does, and that is that it plays these games more accurately than most other emulators. So the idea with the Analogue 3D is that it can replace your original console in that it'll play your original cartridges, it'll also use your original controller, but it's also been modernized for today's day and age. It's got an HDMI output that actually outputs to 4K, and they're also pairing it with the 8-bit DOE Nintendo 64 style controller to kind of give you that more enhanced but modern feel. The console has been in the works for a long time. They say that it took them about 4 years to put it all together, and it was announced earlier this year, and it was supposed to come out a couple months ago, but it hit a couple delays, but now it is finally releasing as of today, the day that I'm releasing this video. It's available in both black and white, and it costs $250, but bear in mind that doesn't come with any controller or any games at all. You'll have to bring all that stuff yourself. It's also worth noting that as of making this video, it is completely out of stock. You can't even pre-order or put your name down or anything. You just basically have to wait until they have more for sale. And this has been a problem throughout all of Analogue's history. Every single console they've ever released has gone out of stock and been very hard to find. In fact, right now, if you go in their store, almost everything is sold out. The Analogue Pocket, the Dock, and then all of their other consoles. The only one that you can actually buy right now is the Analogue Duo, which is a similar FPGA console, but for the TurboGrafx 16. Okay, let's take a look at the hardware now, and of note, Analogue did send this over to me for review, but like with all my videos, all opinions are my own. They're not going to see this ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. So out of the box, it's a very simple experience. We obviously have the device itself, and then a couple cables, and that's about it. Now, what I do appreciate about this device is that the charging brick is just a USB-C plug, and it's a 30-watt charging brick. So I like the idea that you could potentially replace this on your own instead of having to wait for their own proprietary stuff. And it's going to also come with a USB cable for the adapter as well as an HDMI cable. Other than that, we've got the console itself, and then underneath is a small little packet that includes a quick start manual as well as a couple stickers. And then finally underneath, they also provide their own cartridge cleaner. This is just a little foam pad. So the idea is that you have to press the white part against the pins and then you just rub it left and right, and so it hopefully buffs and polishes the pins to the point where if you are having any issues, it will help it out. And I'm sure there's more professional ways to to clean out your Nintendo 64 cartridges, but I appreciate that they include that in the box. Now, my first impressions with the console itself is that it looks very sleek, but still reminiscent of the Nintendo 64. A buddy of mine mailed his over so that we could kind of compare between the two. I got to send it back after this video, but it is pretty cool to be able to see them side by side. And overall, the design language is pretty similar. You can see this kind of, U-shaped swoop right here is also available on the Nintendo 64. The power and the reset buttons are somewhat similar too, although these are a toggle with the power button, and this one's one of those that you would just flick up here on the power side, and then the reset buttons are the same. The original is still a lot chunkier, especially like the circular parts right here. These are not on the Analogue 3D, and so it feels like the 3D is just a more streamlined version of the original. Looking at the front, you can see that yes, the 64 is a lot thicker, but has the same kind of design ethos with those 4 controller ports on the front. So overall, yeah, it kind of feels like the Analogue 3D really is like a tribute to the Nintendo 64, but still being modernized for a 21st century experience. Now, taking a closer look here, I obviously have the black model, and it is a little bit fingerprinty. I've found that over the past couple weeks, just in terms of picking up on my finger oils whenever I touch it, but it's easy to wipe down. We've got a lot of branding around it, so here on the front you can see it says 3D Computer Graphics System with the Analogue logo. On the top left we've got an FPGA logo. In the center we have the Analogue 3D logo, and then finally on the right we've just got, the logos of different technologies, HDMI, Bluetooth, and Wi-Fi. Like with the original, the cartridge reader does have a dust cover on it, so you just kind of push it down and the cartridge goes right into place. Now on the front, beyond just the controller ports, we do have this little LED indicator which also functions as a pairing button. So as you're pairing your Bluetooth controller, you just kind of tap on this and it'll search around for any Bluetooth controller, and that's how it connects. It also has little LEDs on each side that will light up when you have a Bluetooth controller connected, so you know how many controllers are connected at any given time. There's nothing really on either of the sides, but on the back we have all of the I/O. On the far left, we've got our USB-C port for power, 2 USB-A ports for plugging in, say, for example, a controller. Then we have our HDMI for video out, and then an SD card slot, and this will come with an SD card that will be loaded with the Analogue operating system. And the card does have the Analogue logo on it as well. It's kind of neat looking, but it is kind of hard to get in and out just because it requires you to really get in there with your fingernail to pull it out. On the bottom, we've got a full rubber pad which holds the device nicely in place so it doesn't shake around too much. So as far as the hardware, I think the Analogue 3D looks great. It's nice and sleek looking. It's kind of a trimmer form factor compared to the original. I think it's something that will fit very nicely on basically any entertainment center. I'm not a big fan of how fingerprinty the plastic gets. I think just personally I would prefer the white model over the black, but I do like how sleek the black model looks too. Okay, let's talk about controllers for a bit, and the original controllers will work fine with the Analogue 3D. It has that analog port on it, so you can just plug and use these, but I will say that this controller, among all of the controllers that I've tested from Nintendo, is probably the one that is aged the worst. A lot of it really comes down to the analog stick for me. It just feels kind of wonky, even though it was very revolutionary. It's just not a very smooth or gliding feeling analog stick compared to the modern stuff that we have today. In fact, I'm kind of amazed that people were able to play games like Super Mario 64 that well with a controller like this. It just feels so limiting. And then of course we've got this very unique control scheme which is hard to replicate on other controllers. We've got the A and B action buttons, a start button here, and it is worth noting there is no select button on the original Nintendo 64. Then we have the C buttons which, later on morphed into the C stick, for example, with the GameCube. But in general, these will sometimes work as action buttons or menu buttons and sometimes also as analog input functions too. As far as our shoulder buttons, we've got the L and R buttons, and then on the back we've got that one Z button trigger, and this one's very unique. It really depends on how you hold the device and what's going to work the best for you. But yes, this is just a quick digital input, so this is not an analog input right here, and that's how, most people would play their games holding it like this. Now, coinciding with the announcement of the Analogue 3D, 8BitDo announced this controller right here, which they call the 64 Bluetooth controller. And this one really is a modern interpretation of that older controller. We've got that center start button, our A and B button, our C buttons, and then of course our analog stick and D-pad. I'd say that the biggest change here is the analog stick. This thing has a full range of motion and a really nice gliding feel to it. It still has an octagonal gate underneath, but it has this metal rim around the edges which make it feel a lot smoother. You can still kind of click it in each direction, but it feels like you have a much wider range of motion. The caps between the two are basically the same. They're a hard plastic, and I think it feels pretty good and of course very nostalgic. The D-pad is a rubber membrane, but it has a bit of a tighter feel to it and better pivot to it as well, so it doesn't feel mushy to me, it's more tactile. And the action buttons actually feel very clacky and old school too. I think they really nailed it. Same thing with the C buttons, they're a little bit tighter, but still feel very retro. We also do have some function buttons, like this one right here functions as a menu button within the Analogue 3D system. As far as our triggers and bumpers, we've got our L and R buttons again. These feel a little bit squishy. I think they feel good. And then we have our Z buttons on either end. So this is going to be the same input and you can use it with either finger. Now, these are digital inputs, much like on the original. So this isn't going to be a full analog input, but I think it's very fitting for this particular system. And the shell design is identical between the standard 8BitDo Ultimate controller. So it has that nice kind of beefy feel to it, kind of like an Xbox or a Switch Pro controller in just the overall heft and feel. And so yeah, I think this one's actually a very nice controller and a really nice modern update to this original Nintendo 64 experience. And using this controller with the Analogue 3D is kind of a dream come true because it really does feel like it's made for this device. In fact, once you have it paired up, which is super simple to do, all you do is just turn it on, press the pairing button, and then press that pairing button on the front of the analog, and that's it. It'll then find it, and then it'll assign you a number right here, and you can obviously connect to 4 different controllers. And once you've got it paired, it's a seamless experience. You can press the start button to turn the controller on, which will also turn the device on if it's off, and then if you have multiple controllers, it will pair them all up, and then assign you your number based on, the order that you connected to the machine. The only piece of feedback I had in my testing was that I would love to be able to turn off the device with the controller, which is not something that we can do in the software, which we're going to touch on here in a second. Instead, you just have to go and physically flip this off. But I did talk to the company and they said that it is something they're working on and planned in their operating system. So at some point, you should be able to turn the device off with the controller as well, in addition to turning it on. Now, just a few days ago, we had Friendsgiving at our house, and I thought it was a perfect time to test out the Analogue 3D with multiple controllers, and it worked out great. The only console that these kids are familiar with is the Nintendo Switch, and it felt like this was an easier pairing and setup process compared to the Switch and Switch 2 experience. The only hiccup that we ran into is that the kids just weren't used to a control layout like this. They just naturally wanted to use these as the face buttons, so I kind of had to retrain them to be able to use A and B as their primary buttons, but they figured it out pretty quickly. So I think that the idea of capturing the multiplayer experience of the Nintendo 64 is there with the Analogue 3D, and I was able to witness it myself where these kids just played Smash Brothers for like an hour or two. It was kind of crazy. Okay, now let's talk about games and compatibility and how all of this works. Now, of note, Analogue sent me over with my review kit a few games, and it's these 4 right here. So 007, Smash Brothers, Mario Tennis, and Mario Party 3. And so these were sent over for me, and I knew these were coming when they first reached out to me, but I knew this wasn't going to be enough for a full breadth of testing. And like I mentioned, I never really owned a Nintendo 64, so I didn't have many games either. So I had to kind of go on a tear and buy a bunch more games. And let me kind of walk you through that adventure. So to start, I went to the local used game shops that we have here in Hawaii. There are not many, but there is a chain called Book Off, which is a Japanese chain, and they've got 2 stores here on Oahu. And I was able to go there and find some games, but man, they were expensive. $45 for Bust a Move 99, Wave Race 64, which I think was $30, Cruising USA was another 30, I think Star Wars was 45, and then same thing with F-Zero X. So this was another $45. So I spent like over $150 just picking up these 5 games just in the beginning. And I was like, all right, I'm going to go broke if I try to get enough games for this whole experience, at least here living in Hawaii. And so next I went on the online marketplaces, eBay and Mercari, and tried to find a good deal there. And prices are pretty high there too. And then I realized, the Analogue 3D is actually region unlocked. So you're able to play any region games. And so I started looking up Japanese games instead. And there are people who import them in, or you can get them through like Yahoo Auctions on the Japanese website as well. So I just went through eBay and tried to find people who were importing them in and then selling them, and they were a lot cheaper. And so the vast majority of games that I ended up picking up were actually Japanese language games. And I had a lot of fun going through the market and kind of thinking to myself, all right, how many games do I actually need to read the text of in order to understand what's going on, or can I get by just kind of feeling my way through it? And so a game like Super Mario 64 is not one that I feel like I have to read a lot, but it's like $100 for this cartridge in English, or you can get it for about $10 in Japanese. So I ended up buying 17 games altogether for about the same price that I got those 5 games earlier. Star Fox 64, Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie. I've got all of those as well, Mario Golf. And so I kind of went through and picked up games that I specifically didn't think that I would need to require a lot of reading. And so the majority of the games that I've been playing have been in Japanese. It's been pretty fun. It's also just kind of cool to get these games in another language. This is Smash Brothers right here. And I love the way that the art looks on this. And so I really enjoyed just picking up some of my classic favorites on the cheap. And so at this point, I had probably spent $300 just to get enough games that I felt I could properly test this console. And that was kind of crazy. But again, I never had the Nintendo 64. A lot of people who are buying this console probably already have their old cartridges. So this may be a moot point for some people. But yeah, it got expensive really quick. And then at some point, I remembered that there are flashcards for the Nintendo 64. And I'm not sure why I didn't go this route in the beginning, especially as a guy who spends a lot of his time emulating. I think the most household name when it comes to flashcards are EverDrives, for example, this one right here, but they also make them for like the Game Boy Advance. They are really high quality. And of course, this is the first direction I went. Now, there are 2 different versions of the EverDrive. There's what they call the X5 and the X7. The X5 is cheaper, but it has a couple quirks to it. The first is that it doesn't have a real-time clock. And then also, in order to save it onto your SD card, you have to reset the system every time. And that can be annoying. And so the X7 fixes those problems, but it is more expensive. If you buy it directly on their website, it's $160 before shipping, and they ship from the Ukraine, so it can be quite high depending on where you live. I ended up getting mine from Stone Age Gamer, and they sent me an email right around the time that I knew I was expecting the Analogue 3D, and they offered to send me some stuff to try out from their website, and I thought this is the perfect time to get one of their EverDrives because they are customized. Their products are more expensive. It's $215 for the base model, and then they have what they call premium styles as well for $220, but their shipping also is a lot cheaper, so it might be a wash depending on where you live. And the main advantage here is that they have different colored shells, and so you can really customize the look and feel of your EverDrive, and it's going to look really nice in the Analogue 3D. They also offer what they call the Deluxe Edition, which will come with its own protective storage case, and it also adds an additional year to its 1-year warranty, so you get 2 years instead of 1. So if you are looking for something that's a little bit more premium looking, or maybe you don't want to pay the shipping that they have on the EverDrive website, this might be an option to look for. Unfortunately, as of making this video right now, all of these products are out of stock, so hopefully they will restock them soon. Either way, I will leave them linked down below as a thank you for sending this over for me to test. And the one they sent over to me is one of their premium models. This is the Funtastic Crimson one, and you can see that it still has the certification of the original company here, but it has the Stone Age Gamer branding on it as well. Now, unfortunately, the bad thing about this setup is the EverDrive X7 with the latest firmware does not actually get recognized by the Analogue 3D. It'll show up as an unknown cartridge, but I can't actually boot it. So as I'm making this video, yeah, unfortunately, it's not working just yet. If it ever does get up and running, I will leave a pinned comment down below. And I do expect the company to provide some sort of update in the future. In fact, they have made periodic updates to this firmware over the years. The last one was last year. So after that, my journey was still not complete. I then picked up another flash card. This one is called the Summer Cart 64. This one is open source, cheaper than the EverDrive, and it does work with the Analogue 3D. So this is the primary one that I've been using with my console. I picked this one up on Amazon for $83, so it's over half the price of the original one, and it doesn't look quite as nice. I think the sticker here is a bit ugly, but overall, I'm just happy with the fact that it's open source, and it is fully updated and does work with the Analogue 3D. This one also has all the features of the EverDrive and then some. So it's fully region unlocked, so you can use it with, US and Japanese ROMs, no problem. And it also does feature a real-time clock, and it has the ability to save onto the disk without having to reset the system as well. It also has a couple other features that are unique to it, including the fact that it can run DD games. So Nintendo 64 disk drive games will work with this cartridge as well. And the one I bought on Amazon came with a 16GB micro SD card from SanDisk. And so all I did is just pop this out and then put my ROMs on it. Now you might be wondering, where do you get the ROMs to put it on here? So there's a couple different ways to do that. There's the traditional way where people just go on the internet and get it, but you can also just dump your own cartridges using special tools like this one. This thing here is from a company called Save the Hero Builders. This is an open source format cartridge reader that they build for you, and so it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. I made a whole video testing this thing out. I will leave it linked down below. The great thing about this is that it can pull multiple different cartridges, including your save games. So out of of the box, it's going to work with Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, as well as Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, and then of course Nintendo 64. It's even got a slot here for the analog controller, which allows you to pull things from your controller pack as well if you've got your save games or anything else there. And so the idea with the cartridge reader is that you'll pop your cartridge on top and then use the operating system interface right here to dump the game, including any save games that are on the cartridge, directly onto a micro SD card, which you can then put on your computer and then transfer over to the flash card. This thing costs about $100, but it ships from Japan, so shipping might be a little bit more. But I do love the fact that if you've got a large cartridge library, you can pull a lot of your games and saves from it. They also have adapters that allow you to pull like NES cartridges as well. These flash cards can also run emulators, just a few of them, and it's a very mixed bag experience, but we will test that out later too. So you've got a lot of options when it comes to playing games on your Analogue 3D. You can either just play original cartridges, including those from other regions, or you could also go the flash cart route, and that's going to work, especially this Summer Cart 64, which is the one that I recommend just based on its price and the fact that it's working with the Analogue 3D already, and it does have additional features over the EverDrive. Now, it is worth noting, as far as I can tell in the 3D OS operating system, you can't actually load games via the SD card. Now, this is something that sometimes comes out later once these devices launch, where you can play the games from an SD card, so that might be an option where you wouldn't even need a flash cart in the first place, but at least as I'm making this video, it's not available just yet. It is worth noting in the footnotes of the Analogue 3D page, they specifically say that this does not play ROM files, which makes me assume that yes, they're not going to have SD card compatibility, at least not out the gate. And it also says in bullet number 6 that the Analogue 3D does not support Open FPGA. Now, Open FPGA is a feature within the Analogue Pocket, which allows you to run different cores on this device. Even though this is meant primarily to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance games, you can go through here and actually play multiple different systems as well. Neo Geo, NES, Super Nintendo, and so on. So these are cores that have been ported over for the Analogue Pocket, which allows you to play these games off of the micro SD card. So ideally, I would love to have a system like this on the Analogue 3D, a home console system I can plug into my TV to play over 4K and play all of these systems just like that. Now, you can kind of do that already with the Analogue Pocket. I've showed that in my updated reviews, where you can buy the dock, plug that into a TV, and yes, you can play your systems like that, but I'd really love to have a console that could do that as well. So who knows, maybe in the future the Analogue 3D will also get jailbroken like its former consoles in the Analogue Pocket, where we will be able to play additional cores on it, but as it stands right now, unfortunately, you're just going to be able to play Nintendo 64 games on it, and then whatever emulators you can run on a flash card. Okay, now let's take a look at the software experience with 3D OS. So this is the main menu right here when you first log in, and it'll show you your library, and you can use the shoulder buttons to tap over to go into the settings. Now, the way the library works is as you insert your cartridge, it's going to recognize the cartridge based on whatever ROM header that they find. And so we plug in one right here, give it a moment, and then you will see it pop up. And so right off the bat, you're going to see the name of the game, how many players it supports, and whether or not it has additional accessories like a rumble pack. And if you're using the 8-bit DOE controller, the rumble is just going to transfer over to that controller. Now, you're also seeing the box art for this particular game, and it is worth noting that this was preloaded by Analogue. These are going to be custom templates that you can use yourself, so you could add whatever art you would like, but they preloaded it on my particular SD card, so the first day that you get the console, you're not going to see like the fancy Star Wars Rogue Squadron little image here on your cartridge. So let's try it with another cartridge. I'm going to pop it in and you should see it show up. And so here you can see, yeah, it's Mario Tennis. It's got 4-player support, and it supports the transfer pack as well as the rumble pack too. And so as you can imagine, as you plug more games into your Analogue 3D, your library is going to grow, but you can only launch the game that's actually plugged in. As you can see here with F-Zero X, it says play cartridge on the bottom, but if I go over to Mario Tennis, it's grayed out, and that's because that one is not plugged in. Now let's talk a bit about the settings configurations that we can make. We'll tab over to the settings section, and under display, we've got a couple different options here. In the HDMI mode, you've got 4 options. You've got regular 4K at 60, you can do 4K 50 if you want to play them at PAL speeds. You can do the same thing at 1080p and then 1080p 50 too. And so by default, I just keep everything at 4K 60. Below that, we have the auto low latency mode, which is only going to work if your TV supports HDMI 2.1. And I've got this plugged into a capture card, so it's not showing up here. Same thing with HDR. If you have an HDR compatible television, you will be able to turn that on. In the next section, you can see our system settings, which just basically says we have 3D OS 1.1.0, which is the most recent version that they have right now. Beyond that, on the About page, you can go into the user guide as well as the hotkeys to be able to see what things you can do within the menu. So in the case of the 8BitDo controller, you can press the 8BitDo button to bring up the in-game menu. You can also cycle the different display modes by doing that plus the D-pad, and you can press the minus or select button to change out the rumble and controller pack as well. Now, as we open up each game, we can actually do a per game configuration. So if we press the right C button, it'll bring up the configuration that we can do for F-Zero X. For example, if you've already got your own hardware expansion pack, then you don't need to have the virtual one, you could turn that one off. The advanced video processing options down here basically have to do with the original hardware and how everything was processed in the original Nintendo 64. So for example, they had a blur applied to the Nintendo 64 to smooth out some of the hard edges. So you can turn that off and then just use the enhancements that you have in the display mode of the Analogue 3D instead. So you can turn that on or off. Same thing with 32-bit color. There were many games that would process a 32-bit color, but it actually was perceived as being 16-bit. This allows you to see it in a true 32-bit color, which is going to be more accurate. You can also disable the anti-aliasing that the Analogue 3D produces as well to give you more jagged lines, but personally I like the processing that they have, and so I keep this one off as well. At the hardware level, you've also got a couple other options. For example, you can force it to run in original hardware mode. That means that it's going to have slowdown much like it had in the original Nintendo 64. So if you want that 100% accurate experience, you can turn this one on as well. Personally, in all my testing, I had it off just because I appreciated the enhancements that we had on the Analogue 3D. And then finally, the Analogue 3D has its own overclock function. You can set it to auto, and that's going to allow the system to know what is going to be best for each game based on whatever they configured it with previously, but you can also set it up manually. You can go to Enhanced, Enhanced Plus, or Unleashed, which I assume is just going to increase the overclock level. Personally, I've just kept it at the auto setting and have trusted that the engineers know what they're doing in terms of overclock better than me. Now, in the display mode settings, this is where it gets really interesting. We've got multiple options here. We've got BVM, PVM, CRT, scanlines, and then clean. So BVM stands for Broadcast Video Monitors. These are supposed to give you the best image clarity in terms of color and overall accuracy, and this is what was used by big television studios back in the day. These monitors cost tens of thousands of dollars. And so this, theoretically, will give you the best overall accurate image. The PVM is a professional video monitor. These were ones that were more accurate than CRTs, but not to the point of being broadcast level. So this should also be enhanced over the CRT. The CRT is a consumer television, which means that it doesn't have all those same bells and whistles. It might be a little bit less accurate, maybe a little bit softer around the edges, but it all really depends on what kind of look you're going for. And scanlines essentially will give you the scanline look that you will find in CRTs and other televisions, but without the CRT and phosphor glow effect. And then finally, we've got the clean display mode, which will just basically give you the signal coming directly from the game. So this is going to be more close to what you would find in software emulation. So I think to get the best idea of how this is all going to look, let's actually show the game in progress. So here's F-Zero X. I'm going to press the 8BitDo button to bring up the menu. So within here, we can make all the adjustments that we saw in the main menu, but we can do them on the fly. So let's go into display mode here, and you can see that by default, they have it set up with BVM, which is going to give you that most accurate display. And within each of these, you can go and tweak it to your liking as well. The main one that I mess with is image size. So this is going to give you fill by default, which essentially is going to be the same thing as integer scaling. So usually when toggling between the two, you won't see a difference at all. And so this is an integer scale that's blown up as much as possible at a 4K resolution. You can see that in addition to the black bars on the left and right, we've got some at the top and bottom, and that's because we are running at integer scaling. Now the next one is called Integer Plus, and that's going to bring it up to the full scale, but then also keep it at that integer scaling, but then cropping off some of the pixels at the top and bottom. And honestly, on a 4K television, there are not a lot of pixels that are being cut off. And so what I've been doing is playing almost every single game at Integer Plus. It's going to still give us that very accurate look, but then also still have it very big too. So it really comes down to how you prefer to play. If you want to see every single pixel, you don't want to miss out on anything, then I would recommend integer scaling. But if you don't mind, cropping off a little bit at the top and bottom, then Integer Plus does make the image quite a bit bigger. So personally, I've been using BVM, but I know a lot of people prefer the look of a PVM, and so that's the difference right here. It's kind of hard to see, but for me, the pixels look a little bit more squarish compared to BVM, which to me look a little bit more scanline-y. Hopefully this is all coming through as I toggle between the two with the YouTube compression. When swapping over from PVM to consumer or CRT, I definitely see a lot more soft softness in the image as I cycle between the two. And so hopefully you're seeing that as well. But essentially we are going from a more squarish look with PVM to something that's more scanline-y and softer with CRT. If we move from CRT to scanline, you can see that there are more obvious scan lines horizontally here with this image, and it also gets even softer here as well. And then if we move from scanline over to clean, you can see there's a big difference here in that it is a lot more jaggedy and kind of chunky. And I know a lot of people really do enjoy this, especially if they're used to software emulation, so this might be the way that you want to go. And like I said, I have personally been using the BVM function just because I think it's a good balance between like the more squarish and sharp look of the PVM and the softer look of the CRT. Kind of has the best of both worlds while still trusting that it is very accurate too. And so really that's about the extent of the software experience. You can get in and out of the games pretty quickly. You can adjust these settings on the fly. And then of course you can quit a cartridge as well to go back to the main menu and then try something else out. Now personally, I've been playing with my Summer Cart 64 flash cartridge, which is this one right here. It shows up as an unknown cartridge. And it is worth noting that I can configure this one as well. So you can see that I do have it set up for BVM with integer plus as my image size. So as I start up the cartridge, it's just going to boot directly into the flash cart menu. You're going to see a folder called games. This is where I put all of my Nintendo 64 games. And then I've got a couple other folders we'll talk about more when we talk about emulation. So within here, I've got all my favorite Nintendo 64 games. So all I have to do at this point is just choose one, and then I can launch it directly from here. It's going to give me some information about it, and then I can load the ROM. And the startup process is pretty fast. It only takes a couple seconds for the game to actually load. And of course I can go into the menu here, adjust my display settings and everything. And so this is the beauty of using a flash cart in that we're not going to put additional wear and tear on the hardware by changing out the cartridge all the time, but we still have access to all of our favorite games. Now, one of the cool things about the Summer Cart is that it also allows you to play emulators that were built to play on a Nintendo 64's hardware, which means that essentially you can play Game Boy games through a Nintendo 64 using a flash cart. In order to get this set up, I went over to the Summer Cart's open source webpage and just kind of looked at all the different emulator options that they had, loaded up those cores, and then also added some games. And I will say that some of these games will load, but many of them will also not. And it's not that great of an experience anyway. So here I am starting up with Castlevania 2. Now, as you first look at it, you're probably like, wow, this is awesome. You can play a Game Boy game on your console on a television, and it's pretty cool. But one thing that I noticed visually is that there's a lot of interlacing as you move your characters around. And so unfortunately, there's nothing in the Analogue 3D settings that will fix this either. And so it's just kind of a weird looking experience as I was playing it, where yes, you can play a Game Boy game. It doesn't play half bad, but that interlacing is really confusing and kind of just off-putting for me. It's something that will often happen with Sega Saturn emulation, but it's the first time I've seen it with Nintendo 64. So either way, this is something that I just really haven't enjoyed from a visual perspective, but it is cool that yes, you can play your Game Boy and Game Boy Color games on this. And the emulators do have a couple nice functions to them. For example, if you press right on the C buttons, it'll actually turn on fast forward within the Game Boy and Game Boy Color emulators. That's pretty cool. You can also press down on the C button to save a state, and then you can hold the up button to load one as well. So you do have save states available with Game Boy emulation. You just have to deal with the interlacing visual effect here, which for me is kind of distracting. By the way, anytime you want to get back to the flash cart menu, I found the easiest way to do that is to press the 8-bit-do button and then go down here to reset. That's going to reset your cartridge, but then bring you back to the flash cart menu. Now, when it comes to NES games, there is an emulator for this as well, but I have found that it is very finicky, and half the time it doesn't actually load the game properly. And so most of the time when I try to start this up, either nothing will happen or I'll get some sort of error like this. And so what this says to me is definitely do not buy the Analogue 3D in order to play NES games via emulation. I just don't think it's worth it. Same thing with Super Nintendo. Unfortunately, every time I've tried to start up a game, it just starts up in a black screen and stays there. So long story short, when it comes to the overall software experience, I think it's pretty bare bones, but it gets the job done. We've got a lot of different visual effects that we can change. And then it's also very convenient to have a flash cart where you can just jump into all your games without changing out a cartridge. Okay, now that we've talked about the hardware and the software and whatnot, let's talk about the stuff that's a little bit harder to convey. What it's actually like to play on the Analogue 3D compared to the original hardware or from an emulation standpoint. And there were a bunch of things that I wanted to test to kind of get an idea of how close this was to the original hardware in terms of timing and accuracy. And so one of the things I like to test is a console's timing accuracy against the original hardware. So what I will usually do is start up a racing game or something with a timer and then let it play for several minutes and then see how close the times are from one another. So in this case with F-Zero X, I did my best to start the games at the exact same moment, so that way the timer would start at the same time too. And here at the beginning, it is very close. There's like a 7 millisecond difference between the two, which I'm just going to account for as being me not maybe pressing the buttons at the exact same time. It is worth noting that around this time frame, the Nintendo 64 is the one that's running faster than the Analogue 3D. Now, if we fast forward about 3 minutes and 45 seconds, it's a different experience. So here, the Analogue 3D has pulled ahead by about 60 milliseconds altogether. And to be clear here, this is not a huge difference between the two. We're talking about 60 milliseconds in timing over the course of about 4 minutes. As an example with emulation, I found that doing the same sort of test with, say, for example, a Game Boy and Game Boy emulation can be several seconds off after about this much time. So the fact that we have this much variation between the two doesn't really bother me that much. I think it is still very accurate. And also bear in mind that throughout all this testing, I do not have the Force Original Hardware setting turned on, which would probably give us a more accurate one-to-one with the original console, but instead we're using all the enhancements inherent to the Analogue 3D, and even then it's still very close to the original console. Now, I also wanted to test it against emulation to see how much variation was there, so I'm using the AYN Thor exact same test. And you can see that right here in the beginning, there's just a very minute difference between the two. The Nintendo 64 is 2 milliseconds faster than the Thor. Again, fast forward to about 3 minutes and 45 seconds later, and the Thor has also pulled ahead, and again by about 60 milliseconds. So this was kind of an inconclusive test to me in that, one, I was very surprised how close the emulation was to the Analogue 3D, and they both seem very accurate in terms of overall console timing. So really, this test was kind of a wash. I just wanted to make sure there was no huge difference between emulation and the original console, as well as the Analogue 3D, and I was surprised to find that they all three have about the same timing. The next thing I kept an eye on is overall input delay. Like, how does it feel playing on an original console via HDMI, which already has its own inherent input lag? And there are many ways that you can test input delay. You can go with the quantitative route by actually counting frames, and I've done that in videos before, but for this one, I was really trying to get a feel for the Nintendo 64 on its own. Now, I've mentioned this in other videos, but I'm not the most sensitive person when it comes to input delay. I sometimes will not detect it if it's a little bit off, but there are two things that I can definitely feel. Number one is if the input delay is especially bad, I can definitely feel that. And then also if it's especially good, I can feel that too. The way I like to characterize it is that when I play Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo with a CRT TV, it feels like I'm a superhero, just because I am so used to playing it with emulation, which does have a bit of lag to it, that when I finally get on the original console, the character just moves so quickly and responsively that it feels like, yeah, I'm like a superhero at that point. And right out the gate, that's the very same thing that I found with the Analogue 3D and the original console running on the analog television, is that, yes, I felt that same kind of superhero feeling in certain games, namely Cruisin' USA and Star Fox 64, as well as F-Zero X. Each of these games feel a little bit fast twitchy, and I've gotten pretty used to these specific levels using emulation. I'm not half bad in playing them, but man, I was so much better right out the gate when playing with the Analogue 3D and of course the original console. So this is a very non-scientific test right here, but I can say that yes, in terms of input delay, this felt to me closer to the original console than it did any other time I've played it with emulation. The other thing I looked at was visual accuracy. So this is something that I've come across a lot in my emulation testing, is that when a Nintendo 64 game in particular has a bunch of visual glitches to it. Probably one of the most notorious for me is Mario Tennis. This is a game that just never looks right. Often it'll be like the numbers that'll show up on screen. They'll have all sorts of weird textures to them. And then also the shadows underneath the character have never really been accurate when emulating. But when looking at both the original console and the Analogue 3D, they both look accurate to me. The numbers and everything look correct. There's no weird textures going on. And then also the shadows underneath the characters are really accurate. So in this case, I would say pay special attention to the Analogue 3D that's running right now with Wario, and you can see the shadow underneath his feet and how it all just sort of mimics his overall body. Now moving over here to emulation in RetroArch again, playing Mario Tennis on the AYN Thor, and you can see that these shadows are all sorts of weird. They're all kind of fidgety looking, they're kind of flashing and warbling, and they definitely just look like something is off. And this is not something that I saw on original hardware or the Analogue 3D. So in terms of visual fidelity, it does look like the Analogue 3D is closer to original hardware. And of course, this all makes sense to me given that this is an FPGA console, which means that it is cycle accurate and is going to be a lot closer to original hardware than something like software emulation. And I think the proof's in the pudding right here. Another game that always has looked off via emulation has been Killer Instinct Gold. This one looks absolutely accurate as well, and was a lot of fun to play too, by the way, just because we have those C buttons on the controller as opposed to using a right analog stick. And this is one of those games that uses the C buttons as face buttons. And so it actually makes this game playable as opposed to flicking a right analog stick like I often will do in emulation. Another game that has a lot of visual glitches for me in emulation has been Paper Mario. For example, this scene right here with the sunlight coming through the window usually has problems, but you can see it's perfect right here. And then same thing with this scene right here where Bowser uses that star rod to make himself more powerful. This is always super glitchy, and I've only rarely actually see it work correctly in emulation, but of course it looks absolutely fine right now. And then finally, another example is in Mario Kart 64. Every time I'm emulating this game, it's always a crapshoot whether or not you're going to actually see yourself on the Jumbotron above, but sure enough, it is working just fine on the Analogue 3D. So at least based on my rudimentary testing in terms of visual accuracy, yes, the Analogue 3D is doing exactly what I think is intended. And then finally, the last thing that I observed in my testing between the original hardware and the Analogue 3D and software emulation was that the Analogue 3D seemed to have a better frame rate and smoothness compared to both the original console as well as software emulation. And at first it was hard to pick up on. For example, here where I'm testing Star Wars Rogue Squadron, the number one thing I was looking at here was visual accuracy, because this is another game that struggles to play accurately on software emulation. And from a visual standpoint, they both looked very similar to me, and so I didn't really see any issues there. But as I started to actually test them one after another with holding the controller on the original console and then moving over to the 8-bit DOE controller, was that the 8-bit DOE and the Analogue 3D combination was so much smoother. And it worked in two different ways. The first was that, just the overall visual quality of the animation as it was happening just felt a lot smoother and more stable. But as I moved my X-Wing around, it just felt a lot more accurate and responsive. And some of this has to do with the controller in that, it just feels a lot more smooth and gliding as I'm moving it around. So yes, this analog stick is a big improvement over the original, but it also felt like I could just move a little bit more quickly and more responsively with the Analogue 3D. So my guess here is the overclock that they have set up for it is doing some sort of magic behind the scenes, because it felt a lot better to play on the Analogue 3D compared to the original hardware. I saw something similar with Killer Instinct Gold and F-Zero GX where they just played at a higher frame rate. So I think here again that there is some sort of frame rate that is being unlocked thanks to that overclocking. So not only do these games look accurate like the original console and feel better because we have that 8-bit DOE controller, but they also seem to be running at a higher frame rate with certain games. And then finally, my last example here is GoldenEye 007. This is one that is notorious for having a lot of slowdowns, both on the original console and even in software emulation. If you push enough power to it, sometimes it can get pretty smooth, but it's pretty rare when it is. And with the Analogue 3D, it kind of felt like it was splitting the difference between the two, where I had a pretty smooth frame rate, but it still had a little bit of slowdown here and there depending on the scene and everything else. And so this, again, felt more like the original console, but slightly enhanced because it was playing faster, but not to the point of actually being completely smooth. So in the end, I am assuming that Analogue's target here was to give you a very authentic experience, but enhance it in certain ways. We see that with all the different visual options that they present here, and I think that I can kind of feel that as well as I'm actually playing these games, especially when comparing them directly to the original console. It's kind of hard to describe, but when playing on the Analogue 3D, it feels like you're playing a Nintendo 64 that's enhanced in all the right ways, but not to the point of breaking your suspension of disbelief in that you still think you're playing on an original Nintendo 64 that is somehow magically better. Now that being said, there are some advantages to using software emulation over something like the Analogue 3D. We've got the ability to upscale graphics if they are 3D based, and so for example here with Star Fox 64, I'm playing this game at a 1440p resolution right now, and it looks amazing, a lot sharper and crisper than on the Analogue 3D or the original console. When using something like RetroArch, like I'm doing on the Thor right now, it also gives me a ton of options when it comes to scaling and shaders, so I can really enhance the visual quality as well. But at the same time, it is worth acknowledging that the Analogue 3D does an excellent job in terms of visual quality between all the different settings that they have here, which I think is greatly enhanced compared to something like the Analogue Pocket. And then finally, the other advantage of using software emulation is that the quality of life improvements that are baked into a lot of the software. So for example, the ability to use a save state so you can save the game at any time and jump right back into it, or the ability to use fast forward or even rewind depending on the emulator that you're using. So at the end of the day, the Analogue 3D does feel more like the original console, but enhanced in all the right ways, but it's still missing some of the features that you can find in software emulation, like being able to upscale the graphics, and then also use things like save states and fast forward. So if those are your priority, then probably software emulation might be a better fit, but if you're looking for something that is more reminiscent of the original console, then I think the Analogue 3D really has it in spades. Okay, and so now the last section that I wanted to discuss in this video is how I have been playing the Analogue 3D and how it's kind of changed the way that I feel about the Nintendo 64 and how it's changed the way I approach certain games as well. Let's start with Banjo-Kazooie. This is a game that I test all the time. I usually just go to the first level, kind of move the character around and see what the frame rate is like and whether or not it's accurate, and then just get an idea of whether or not Nintendo 64 is going to be playable on that particular handheld. And when I'm emulating, I'm going to be using the controller that comes with that handheld, or if I'm doing it on a computer, I'm going to use like a regular 8-bit controller. And the first big revelation that I had when testing out this system was that having a controller that actually matches the button input is a really big deal when it comes to the Nintendo 64. Up until I started testing this game, I assumed that Banjo-Kazooie was a very simple game. You can either jump and you can punch, and that's about it. It felt like a really floaty version of Mario 64. But what I learned when playing with the analog controller is that there is a much deeper subset of controls and moves within the controller itself, and they're all mapped to the C buttons, which generally are going to be mapped to a right analog stick on any other controller. And so as I started to get further in the game, I realized that this is a much deeper game when it comes to the overall control scheme, which I did not understand until I had this 8-bit controller to test with. Now, this isn't really a testament to the Analogue 3D, but rather the combination between the two of the controller and the console itself, because it's the controller that's doing all the heavy lifting in Banjo-Kazooie, which gives us that more accurate representation of what it was like to play this game originally. So my big takeaway here was that getting the 8-bit controller to play Nintendo 64 games, even if you're going to use software emulation, kind of feels like a must for games like Banjo-Kazooie, because it really did unlock the actual game for me. Another experience that I had was when playing Ocarina of Time. Now, this is a game that I've started many times before and have never actually really finished. And what I learned when playing with the Analogue 3D is that it forces you to play in the pacing of the original game. I'm so used to playing this in software emulation where I can fast forward all the boring parts and kind of get through all that stuff. But when you're forced with the Analogue 3D to actually enjoy it in the exact same timing as it was previously, then it makes you slow down and really kind of appreciate how it was back in the mid-90s when this game first released. And you would think in today's day and age where we are bombarded by information and have everything at our fingertips that this would just be agonizingly slow. But instead, it actually got me to slow down a little bit and enjoy the pacing of the mid-90s. So I ended up looking forward to playing this game every night just because I enjoyed how relaxing it made me feel as I was playing it, because yes, it has a slower timing to it, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And so I've now decided that if I am ever going to actually sit down and play through Ocarina of Time, I'm going to do it on the Analogue 3D because I like that it forces me to enjoy this pacing. And even though, yes, the 3DS version looks a little bit better, I love the idea of kind of kicking back on a couch and enjoying it as is. Okay, at this point, I feel like I've said everything that I could about the Analogue 3D, so let's wrap up and start talking about what I like and what I don't like about it. As always, we'll start with what I like. And number one, this is a very sleek machine. I love the 90s plus 2025 vibe that we have here, in that it looks kind of modern, but also looks a little retro. I also love the fact that they kept the multiplayer focused aspect of this console, and the fact that, about 70% of games had a multiplayer function to them, and we've got those 4 controller ports on the front and the ability to pair it with 4 Bluetooth controllers. Speaking of controllers, I love this 8-bit controller. Even if you're not going to be getting the Analogue 3D, but you want to play Nintendo 64 games, I think this controller is a must-have. And I think it's a perfect pairing for the Analogue 3D in terms of functionality, but then also just the overall visual quality. Personally, I would have loved to have seen a little bit more customization options for the controller, like the ability to swap out the C buttons for different colors, or the ability to personalize it a little bit more, just because having 4 black controllers like this in a row does get a little bit confusing when you are setting up a multiplayer session. Another thing I love about the Analogue 3D is the amount of visual options that we have. If you want CRT versus scanline versus PVM versus BVM, you've got all those options and you can customize them how you would like. I'm the kind of guy who loves shaders, and I feel like this has more options than I need, and I always love being in that position. I also like the overall feel of 3DOS. It's super simple and easy to navigate, and it's pretty intuitive, to the point where I just kind of handed controllers to my kids and they figured it out. But probably the most important factor here is that the Analogue 3D just feels right. When a lot of people think about playing an old console, they usually look at it with rose-tinted glasses, like they remember the old days of sitting there with their Game Boy under the covers with a flashlight playing Pokemon, and just the nostalgia of that experience. But often if you go back and grab your original console, it doesn't quite live up to how you have it in your mind. But for the Analogue 3D, I kind of feel like it meets you halfway. Not only does it look and feel like the original experience, but it's got enhancements in there that you may or may not even notice that kind of bring it up to your expectations. And so it feels almost like playing one of those consoles with the rose-tinted glasses at the same time. But of course, the Analogue 3D is not perfect, so let's talk about some of the things I don't like about it. Number one is the availability of this console. It was up for pre-order, earlier this year, and then it was out of stock for a while, and then the launch was delayed for a long time, and now it's finally launching, but you are not able to buy it. It is completely sold out right now. And this has always been an issue with Analogue products, is that they are kind of limited edition, and they just kind of come and go, and you have to be really quick on the dial if you do want to pick one up. And so the negative for me here is the fact that this is a good console that is going to be hard to find, and we have no idea how easy it will be in the future either. The next negative aspect is that it has a high entry price. Now, I think the actual console price, $250 for what you're getting, is reasonable. This is a console that has really nice material quality to it and a lot of enhancements within the software, and it just works the way it's intended. But that $250 price point is also making a lot of assumptions. It doesn't come with a controller, so do you have your own controller already, or are you going to be buying new ones for $40 a piece? It also makes some assumptions about the games and whether or not you have cartridges of your own, or are you going to buy, them on the used marketplace and spend upwards of $500 like I did, or are you going to grab a flash cart for about $80, $85 to be able to put everything on at once? And so when you put it all together, it does feel like an expensive console. It's not a $250 machine unless you have all of your games and all your controllers and you're happy with that. And that kind of leads into my next point, in that it does feel a bit like a lockdown experience in both good and bad ways. I think it's good in that it's an offline console and it just feels like you're unplugging from the modern age and getting back to that 90s vibe. But at the same time, Analogue is a company who has shown that they are willing to open up some of their devices to allow for additional use cases. The Analogue Pocket and the Open FPGA platform is a perfect example. This is something that greatly enhanced the Analogue Pocket to allow us to play a bunch of different cores and systems directly on this machine that was mostly intended to play Game Boy and Game Boy Advance in the first place. And it may come to pass that we are able to use something like Open FPGA on the Analogue 3D, but the company themselves are saying that it's not going to happen, at least on their website. Now, depending on how you look at it, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because after all, this thing is made to play Nintendo 64 games, but it does feel like a more limited and lockdown experience from a company who has already shown that they are willing to open up others. And so the way I see it, the Analogue 3D is so good at playing Nintendo 64 that it makes me want to turn this console into my Super Nintendo and my Nintendo at the same time, and so I would love to see Analogue open up those cores within their FPGA. And then finally, this one's definitely a nitpick, but I do think that the black model is a little bit too smudgy in its overall plastics, and so if this bothers you as well, I would recommend checking out the white model instead. So wrapping this very long video up, I think when it comes down to it, the Analogue 3D does exactly what it's set out to be. It's supposed to be a modern version of the Nintendo 64, and as far as I can tell, in every single way, they nailed it. It captures the spirit of the Nintendo 64 while improving it in just about every single way. The form factor is sleeker and smaller, it works on modern televisions and is specifically tuned for 4K televisions, and they also debuted an awesome 8-bit DOE controller to go along with it, and I think overall this is just kind of a home run. To put it another way, I feel like the Analogue 3D is so good that it has soured my experience of playing Nintendo 64 in any other way. I don't want to play it on software emulation if I've got the Analogue 3D around, and at the same time, I don't really want to play any of these games on the original console either, just because they are so much better on the Analogue 3D in terms of just overall feel, the ability to use this more modern controller, and then the conveniences of having HDMI hooked up to a 4K TV. At the end of the day, if you're looking for a recommendation, I think that if this is within your budget and you really do treasure the Nintendo 64, then I think it is absolutely worth it. For everybody else, I would say that software emulation gets you close enough, but if you're looking for that really pure experience, advanced, then I think the Analogue 3D is unmatched. Let me know what you think of the Analogue 3D in the comments down below, and also let me know your favorite Nintendo 64 game. I'm trying to build a catalog here because I'm enjoying this thing so much, so I need some recommendations. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. We will see you next time. Happy gaming.